Thank you for being here. Do we have any newbies who are here for the first time? Nice to see you. Well, and a special welcome. You're all welcome, but especially the newcomers. Welcome to the Dweck Auditorium here at Brooklyn Public Library. My name is Joel Whitney. I'm part of the team that curates the arts and culture programs, and it is a true pleasure to see you. This is also being streamed to our Facebook page, which is at BPL Presents. So when the Q&A comes and you get the chance to ask a question, just be aware that you'll be streamed to our Facebook page, which means you'll be on video over there. I couldn't be more excited to welcome our four speakers tonight. This is an event that is co-presented with Lapham's Quarterly. BPL's second read examines Pramodia Ananta Tour's The Buru Quartet and its courageous, even heroic composition. With translator author Max Lane, playwright Faiza Marzuki, author Siddharth Deb, and scholar Chris Gogwilt, who Chris will introduce the other panelists in a moment. This Earth of Mankind came out in 1980 in its original Bahasa Indonesian, but it was dreamed of long before. It recounts the life of Minka, a Javanese student at a Dutch school when only Europeans could go to school there. Minka meets the concubine of a Dutch colonizer. She runs his business, and when Minka falls in love with and marries her daughter Annelies, the Dutch invalidate the marriage, and Minka wonders if Europeans believe their own values. From here, This Earth of Mankind recounts the story of Indonesian national awakening from its earliest seed, prodded by this horrific injustice. BPL's second read considers the quartet, This Earth of Mankind, and its three sequels, how it fits into our moment. But what is our moment? It is an age, yet another one, when many in the United States are banning books, banning certain periods of history outright. Pramodia would recognize this moment that we're living in, and he came pretty close to it as he died in 2006 during the Bush administration. The occasion for this talk comes via Max Lane. In addition to translating all four of the novels into English in the 1980s, Max, in his new book, Indonesia Out of Exile, How Pramodia's Buru Quartet Killed a Dictatorship, recounts the collaboration between Pramodia and his two co-publishers, Yosef Isaac and Hasim Rahman. The far-right Suharto dictatorship banned the first novel as soon as it appeared. In defiance of the dictatorship, Pramodia and his co-publishers went on to publish three sequels, each time followed by another battle and then a ban. Indonesia Out of Exile tells of these men's struggle, their arrests and imprisonment. They returned from exile to a different Indonesia, its radical past suppressed, its people terrorized. Set in a time when even the idea of Indonesia had not yet formed, the books tell an inspiring creation story that even now inspires a new generation. More on that in a moment. But this story goes back further. Pramodia was researching the books when he was arrested in 1965 with some 150,000 others. Their fate could have been much worse. There was the small problem of a large, strong communist party in Indonesia. It was a political party, but it was not in government. 20 million strong. By some estimates, the coup regime of Suharto killed 1 to 3 million students and others presumed guilty of leftism to prevent them from entering government with Sukarno. What was the U.S. role? Under the Johnson administration, the State Department handed the death squad commanders lists of names to add to the carnage. These documents were released in 2017. Pramodia, who incidentally was not a member of the PKI, used to cite the larger number, 3 million. But why arrest him, a non-member? Suharto, the dictator, told a French journalist in 1972 that Pramodia would likely have defended the non-violent President Sukarno if some violent coup brought the Communist Party into government alongside Sukarno. The composition of the novels within what the New York Times describes as Suharto's gulag is worthy of note before we start, and then I will turn it over, I promise. Before he was allowed to have paper during his 14 years of forced labor, Pramodia spoke his early chapters aloud, regaling fellow prisoners with morale-boosting feminist liberation stories of the Dutch concubine's strength and independence, her name Nyai Ontosoro. Among Promodia's fellow prisoners was at least one shadow puppeteer whose memory was known to be quite good and who helped preserve the early drafts. Yet even when his freedom to write was restored, even then he had manuscripts confiscated and destroyed for good, embittering him for a long time. Nevertheless, his comrades helped make him paper from discarded bags of cement. They traded chickens for pencils. They created glue from local fruits and weighed the pages down with concrete slabs so the manuscripts would stay together as he buried them in banana leaves to preserve them. In response, he doubled down on secrecy in response to the theft of previous manuscripts and smuggled the drafted copies of his books off the prison island through various channels, including the Catholic priest. Obviously, this is on brand for Brooklyn Public Library. If you've heard anything about BPL's Books Unbanned campaign, where young people around the country can get a free electronic library card and check out books in Brooklyn from whatever state they live in, which is banning them. Yes, thank you. In the most compelling argument of his book, Max argues that the novels served as a roadmap to young people in Indonesia, namely student protesters. For multiple generations, or for one long generation, however you look at that, these protests in 1974, 1978, and again, to a lesser degree in the 80s, had failed. But the novels gave them the clue to help bring down Suharto in 1998. How? By encouraging them to align with those beyond the university, including feminists, labor, farmers, and so on. An evergreen roadmap, I would say, for us all. Tonight's second read is presented with Lapham's Quarterly, who are sponsoring the ASL interpretation that will be happening on our stream, along with our bookseller at Greenlight Bookstore, who are selling Max's book and This Earth of Mankind Outside, which Max will sign. You should pick up copies and subscribe to this wonderful quarterly magazine of history and ideas. And the Quarterly's prison distribution program has delivered copies of this magazine at no cost to incarcerated readers in 40 states, including every prison in New York. And Adam Isco, an editor from the magazine, will be sticking around after the panel to answer questions and chat about how you can help. And for its spring 2023 issue, the Quarterly takes up the topic freedom. Finally tonight, we'll be in the hands of our moderator, Christopher Gogwilt, who will introduce the panel, author of The Passage of Literature on Joseph Conrad and Promodia, among others. Chris is also the author of The Fiction of Geopolitics and the Invention of the West, Joseph Conrad and the Double Mapping of Europe and Empire. He has published numerous essays, including the novel In the Nation. He is the co-editor of the volume of essays Mockingbird Technologies, The Poetics of Parroting, Mimicry, and Other Starling Tropes. I love that pun. When Promodia came to the U.S. for his one and only visit after his city arrest ended with the dictatorship and his memoir on life in the prison island was translated, The Mute Soliloquy, Gogwilt hosted him at Fordham University and watched Promodia explore the city. Prem and friends went to the Met Opera, proceeded to promptly fall asleep. So without any further ado, please welcome Chris Gogwilt with Max Lane, Faiza Marzuki, and Siddhartha Deb.
Hello, many thanks. Welcome. I'm delighted to be able to introduce our speakers, playwright Faiza Marzuki, translator Max Lane, novelist Siddhartha Deb, and I'm looking forward to our discussion of the great Indonesian writer Pramudia Nantatur. The work of Pramudia, or Pram to use the standard abbreviation, has had an enormous long-lasting influence within and beyond Indonesia. So, introducing our speakers today, I'd like to invite each of them to address one general question, and then we can go from there. What does it mean to be reading today the quartet of novels that Pram composed in the Buru Island prison camps in the 1970s and that were published in the 1980s and, of course, immediately banned in Indonesia. Pram's work has always, it seems to me, had a delayed effect on its readers. And I'm most interested in the newest readers to Pram. I'm always learning from my students, for instance. That delayed effect is a part of the history of their composition, first told orally to his fellow prisoners and then written down and smuggled out of the prison camps. It's also a part of the work of rendering in fiction the historical research Pram had conducted in the late 50s, early 60s, all of which was destroyed when he was arrested in 1965. And it's part of the style and form of the story that begins with This Earth of Mankind, Bumi Manusia, and continues on through, or rather gets cut off with, the final volume, House of Glass. In the preface to his anthology of pre-Indonesian literature, Pram wrote something I think remains important for the Buru Quartet, which itself revisits the historical moment of those pre-Indonesian texts. He wrote, quote, "What is published here has not yet for certain been read, but what is read here has already for certain been published." I can't help thinking that the question of readership of those pre-Indonesian texts collected in that anthology is part of the long-delayed effect Pram's own work has on readers of all kinds, including on all of us gathered here today. So, in asking the general question, what does it mean to be reading Pram's Buru Quartet today, I'm also hoping to hear responses from each of you here on the panel, but also in the audience, that might illuminate this long-delayed effect on your work. So Faiza Madzuki, let me introduce briefly everyone, and then I'll turn things first to Faiza. As playwright and director, has already contributed substantially to the enduring after effects of Pram's work. She wrote and produced 2 versions of a play based on Nyai Ontosoro, one of the main characters, if perhaps the main character in the Buru tetralogy. She's also the writer and director of the silent song of the Genjer Flowers that some of you may already have been lucky enough to see in the recent screening at the People's Forum. And I believe she's working on a future play based on another of Pram's novel, Arus Balik. Maybe? Maybe. Yeah, okay. Max Lane, as the translator of This Earth of Mankind and all the novels of the Buru Quartet, has also played an instrumental part in enabling English readers to experience the power of Pram's novels. And his recent book, which I was going to hold up, but it's down here. Oh, yeah, Siddharth, thanks. His recent book, Indonesia Out of Exile, that we're celebrating today, sheds important light on how the Buru Quartet emerged in defiance of the Suharto dictatorship and how it contributed to the collapse of the same dictatorship in 1998, as succinctly captured in the subtitle of Max Lane's book, How Pramudia's Buru Quartet Killed a Dictatorship. Finally, Siddharth Deb, novelist, journalist, essayist, and fellow academic, if I can call you that, is the author of The Beautiful and the Damned, A Portrait of the New India, the novels The Point of Return and An Outline of the Republic, with another novel due out later this month, The Light at the End of the World. I'm eager to hear how Pram's work may relate to, echo, or perhaps already belong to your work. So, let me invite first Faiza to address the question. Why are we reading? What's the significance of reading Pramudia today for you?
Thank you. First, I would like to thank you to everyone here and to Brooklyn Library. The question about what meaning you read Pramudia Anantatur, especially the tetralogy, right? For me, reading Pramudia Anantatur's novels of tetralogy is like reading about Indonesia. Even though in those novel tetralogy, I just realized from Max that in tetralogy, no even one word about Indonesia. But when I read the novel, I feel like very close to start understand my country, Indonesia. So, first time I read Pramudia Anantatur in 1994, a bit late actually, you know, because I finished high school. When I was in high school, I didn't read at all about Pram books. Even I didn't know. It's like others, children of Indonesia at that time didn't know about Pram books. But when I read the first time, I felt like, wow, this is, you know, I was so happy. And not just happy, but proud when I read the book. That's what I felt. And that's why when I, you know, because of so rich story and so many characters that you can inspire from them, especially for me, Nyai Ontosoro. When I read that books, suddenly I had imagination about, actually my first imagination about that books, about film, because all the, you know, there are so many dramatic elements in the books, so my imagination was, oh, this is very good if this book in visual way, film. But then my background, you know, playwright, I tried to reread again and then write the story. And then I realized for me, the first book, the most important character for me was Nyai Ontosoro. Why? You know, Nyai Ontosoro is an example for Indonesian women how the young Sanikem, if you read, you know, the novel Sanikem, sold by his father to the Tuan Melema, a Dutch colonial. It's reflect about many other women in Indonesia, even today. It's, you know, it's very, for me, it's very relevant today. There are still many trafficking problem, many, you know. So that's inspired me about how young Sanikem become victim of patriarchy and colonial system and fight for her sovereignty, you know, until one end of line of Bumi Manusia, this earth of mankind, kita telah melawan sehormat-hormatnya, how you can call in English. You later can translate. That's a very, very good line for me to understand people like Sanikem, women like Sanikem become Nyai Ontosoro. And to connect about Indonesia, that's what we learn. How we understood about Indonesia, about our nation, about my country. So that's very inspired, you know, in many ways. And even until today, many form of tetralogy become, you know, even some adapt into music, into dance as Nyai Ontosoro. That's what I mean, what I feel when I read Bumi Manusia in the first stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Max.
Maybe you can
What-
say kita telah melawan.
Or the
Sorry for that.
child we fought back well and honorably was the
Yeah, that's
key, one of the final lines of This Earth and Mankind. I was thinking about, because Chris told us the question, so I was thinking about the answer earlier on. And I thought I'd make a comment about what genre This Earth and Mankind is. It's obviously a novel, and I think most commentators or writers and readers would see it as historical fiction. But I think there's another way to look at it. And it's a genre which has come into fashion, I think, the last 10 or 20 years. And, you know, some of my favorite entertaining novels that I read are in this genre, like Frank Herbert's Dune. I'm not a fan of the Hobbit ones, what's that? The Lord of the Rings, but it's the genre of world creation. And that's what Pramudya does, especially in This Earth of Mankind. He creates a very dynamic and alive world. But it's not a fictional world. It's a reality. It's the reality of the situation in the Dutch East Indies at the beginning of the 20th century. And it was a reality full of a myriad interacting factors, each creating a very dynamic chemistry, which eventually created something which had never existed on the earth before. And I think this is part of why it's so powerful, and part of why Vivina Pfizer said when she read it, she felt proud. And I know back in the 1980s and even today, people who read it for the first time are very inspired by it, because it's a story of how something that never existed on the earth before came into being, namely Indonesia, a completely new nation. Because Indonesia is not simply an amalgam of Java plus Bali plus Minangkabau plus whatever. It's not an amalgam of all the different traditional ethnic cultures. It's something totally and absolutely new. And I think so. It's a world creation work, but recreating a world that actually did exist and which gave birth to Indonesia and Indonesians. And so I think that's part of the power. As when it was read back in the 1980s, there was no delayed effect in the 1980s. There was an immediate effect on the readers, stirring things up quite a bit, especially amongst young people. And I think it's the same today. Have I got time to tell a very quick anecdote? And I was in the tour I'm doing of the United States now. I was in University of California, Los Angeles, giving a seminar. So most of the audience were academics or postgraduate students and some undergraduate students. And one of the undergraduate students was an Indonesian and said, I read Pramudya, had a big impact on me. It means I feel I should now be doing something to change Indonesia. What should I do? So I told her a story about how Pramudya told me, if you're a genuine progressive person who wants change, you must join a party, an organization to change things. And I found out later, this young woman who'd read Pramudya back in high school in Indonesia, she's an undergraduate in UCLA, been there for 2 years, had indeed done exactly that. Joined a socialist organization on the UCLA campus. So it's a delayed effect in the sense that the book's been in circulation now for 40 years, but the effect on her was not delayed. She read it and very quickly her consciousness, it helped change her consciousness and helped her get active. And I think that's also part of the process that's already started. It's been ongoing since up and down because of the change in the political situation, but it's a part of the process that's ongoing now as well.
Thank you, and I hope we have a chance to come back to talk about the kind of influence that you're describing, the influence that these books have on people in Indonesia, outside Indonesia. But Siddharth, maybe we could tell, what does reading Pramudya now mean for you?
Well, I think both Faiza and Max have started us off very nicely. But for me, I knew of Pramudya before I read the books because he had a very big reputation in India, in Pakistan. And when I was a graduate student here, I had just come to New York, to Columbia, and Pramudya visited, and Chris, you were part of having him come over. And I remember this fellow graduate student of mine, this Pakistani student friend of mine, and we went to see Pramudya at the event. But we hadn't read his books, but we knew who he was. We knew the story of the books. And I read the Buru Quartet much, much later. And I think the expectation one has is that the story of the books is very dramatic, right? Because it's elated. It's about being in a prison island. It's about telling the stories to other prisoners to keep the fiction alive. These are extreme conditions and so the story of the story is very gripping. And then, of course, Pramodaya is a very big figure in terms of his politics, his left politics. So I think I had a certain expectation of a very serious book. And it is that. It is serious. It is deeply, deeply engaged. But I think what really surprised me and pleased me as a writer is that it's actually a gripping read. It's not, I think maybe I had this slight expectation that there is going to be a lot of politics, there is going to be a lot of history, and it's there. But you can't put it down because the characters are incredibly complex. It's a book that reads really well from the perspective of 2023. I think that's what really surprised me. That, sometimes you read somebody who's progressive, but you cringe at how maybe they're representing women. You cringe at perhaps how they're representing, in an Indian context, caste, for instance, right? You can be very progressive for the time. But Pramodaya isn't. That's the amazing thing. All the characters are really complex. They're really nuanced. This applies to even the Dutch characters. They are not cartoon stock villains. This applies to the Europeans. There's a great range among them of politics, of attitude, of character. I mean, the Dutch teacher, Magda Peters, she's very central to the sort of the journey, this sort of journey of ideas, of learning about oneself that the main character takes. And she's a very sympathetic character, even if she is limited in some ways by her being colonial. So I think one of the things is that you read the book, on the one hand, it's really gripping, and I think it's gripping for the reasons that Max said, that he's really good at world building. It is a Bildungsroman, and it's also an epic at the same time. Like when Minker takes a train journey and he's going back for the first time to the place he's from, Pramodaya has kept us waiting. You're like, he doesn't tell us, the main character, exactly his background. We get that he's a kind of an educated, sort of upper class Javanese, kind of living in this in-between world, of the European and the native. But there's a lot about him that's mysterious. The train journey is just beautifully sketched out. It's very visual. I mean, it's very visual. The world building is fantastic. The characters, even the minor characters, are really amazing. And so when I started reading it, I said, okay, I can see how this would have been pleasurable when being told as a story in prison to the other inmates. This would have been really, really like liberating to be listening to this story in these very, very dire, oppressive circumstances. So it's filled with that kind of imaginative spirit. So that's one of the things that's really surprising for me. So, it is a great summer read. I have no personal stake in it, beyond just the pleasure of a reader and a fellow writer. But this is the quartet is going to be, the rest of it is going to be a summer reading. And it's not slow, it doesn't drag, you can't put it down. You keep thinking, the characters are incredible. And the other thing is that it speaks really well to the contemporary moment, because it talks about gender, it talks about class, it talks about political organization, it talks about what it means to try and become somebody. It talks about what it is to be between different worlds and not fully in one or the other. It talks about slavery. Nyai Ontosoro, when she first, I'm giving you a little bit of the story, but when she first meets Magda Peters, the women characters are amazing, even though the main character is a man. The women characters are, we had this conversation before coming in, and who's your favorite character? I said, Nyai Ontosoro, because she's just amazing. But the other favorite character is the Dutch teacher. She's also a woman, Magda Peters, and when they meet for the first time, Nyai Ontosoro says, I'm a slave. And again, I think it just speaks to contemporary debates about abolition, about prison, about decolonization, about politics, about the environment. And in that sense, it's really quite prophetic and it's a really incredible book for our times. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to hear you talk more about the story.
Very good reader.
Yes.
Remember everything.
And actually, I love the distinction you make between the story and the story about the story. And I'm completely divided as to which direction to go, because I want to hear you talk about the story, and I also want to hear Max talk about the story of the story, how it emerged, because both of these are very important. They're, of course, linked. I think we should talk a bit more about the story until the moment when we start to spoil it, because you haven't finished it. Is that right?
I just read the last line because
Okay.
of Feza and Max's. I wanted to do
but I mean
look
the
at
quartet.
translation.
The quartet.
I haven't reached the quartet.
Well, no, I mean, there's
Yeah,
I don't know how many of the audience have read to the end, because there's a big surprise with the fourth volume. So I think we should talk about the story until we get to the point where people say, stop, spoiler alert. And so, but I want to pick up your suggestion. Let's talk about who your favorite character is. Maybe we know, Faiza, who your favorite character is, but maybe you want to talk a bit about that?
Nyai Ontosoro and Princess Karasuta.
Tell us.
You know, yeah, of course, all the characters very, very gripping, and because Pram create those characters as Dave said, all the characters very complex. It's not white and black characters or stereotypical characters. So that's all the readers have, who's the favorite. For me, Ontosoro, but all the characters, as I also very, very much love the Magda Peters, as a woman from the white people in the colonial era, but she also, is very much aware also about her position at the time, and also Nyai Ontosoro. Very nice. I remember to create that scene on my stage about when Nyai Ontosoro met Magda Peters. I remember very much that. So I love that one. Nyai Ontosoro, Princess Karasuta, Minke. Okay, I love him, but ambiguous, ambiguous characters. When I adapted the tetralogy into the play, everyone asked me, why Faiza, why you took Nyai Ontosoro become focus? If you read the tetralogy from the beginning, the narrator Minke, right? In the beginning story, Minke already become full of man, quote unquote, full, big man. But actually, for me, in the first tetralogy, This Earth of Mankind, Nyai Ontosoro is the subject of the story, the main character of the whole story. So that way is even Minke learn many things from Nyai Ontosoro. Not Ontosoro learn from Minke, but Nyai Ontosoro teach many things even about the class consciousness, about the colonial system. Teach Minke. Minke in that story is still very young, high school, but already curious everything, even just in love with, even like adored to Nyai Ontosoro. And for me, Ontosoro really dragged me into the inspiration character, is, to become someone. From Sanikem become Nyai Ontosoro. It's something for me. It's a very strong character as women. I think Prams create many women character in tetralogy similar, from victim become fight in any ways. So yeah, I think I remember Pram always told the audience when in the public meeting, he very much respect to his mother. And even he said, everything I got today from my mom, from my mother. And almost all in his writing, besides tetralogy, the girl from the coast, Midah bergigi emas, I forgot, Midah with the gold teeth. Is it? All those characters similar with Nyai Ontosoro. So, I think Pram understood how the society, how the position of women in many era, even in like other novel called Larasati, the set on Japanese era, also similar. The girl from the coast is between about the women who face the feudal system, and Nyai Ontosoro in the colonial system. They all promise very inspired. He said from mother, and also Pram always even in the tetralogy, he also mentioned about the Kartini. So he very much realized about the role of women. And in many public meeting, when audience asks to Pram, how about the future of Indonesia? Too, he said, up to the young generation and to women. That's I love about him. Okay.
Thank you. Max, who's your favorite character?
From This Earth of Mankind, I don't know that I have one. Well, I have been asked that question in Indonesia, and I would usually reply, Mimi, the milkmaid, who only appears for a couple of pages. But she's sort of representative of the Indonesia to come, like the next wave of change. And then the second comment I would make in terms of the characters is the Minka character. But one of the secrets of the book, This Earth of Mankind, and also to a lesser extent, but partially the second volume and the third volume, but in the first volume in particular, I think it's very important to be able to understand and this is something which really I found quite had a big impact on me when thinking about it, that there's two Minkas. We learn about the second Minka and him writing how the second Minka wrote Bumi Manusia, or how Pramudia depicts him as, or tells the story of how Minka wrote Bumi Manusia. But we find out, this is not too much of a spoiler, but you find out in the fourth volume the process whereby Minka, the character Minka, wrote Bumi Manusia, This Earth of Mankind. So by the time he writes it, he's had many experiences, many very rich experiences, both in his private life and politically. So it was a very mature, experienced Minka who wrote This Earth of Mankind. Of course, Pramudia wrote it, but it was Minka as the narrator. So in his voice, telling the story, there's this real depth, maturity, wisdom, strength. The other Minka is the Minka that he tells about, who is less impressive, except in terms of his the commitment to being curious, to finding out what it's all about. So that Minka, that dual Minka, I still find very powerful. And then the milkmaid, and of course, in the end, as Pfizer says, in the end you can't escape the strength of character of Nyai Ontosoro herself.
Can I just briefly ask, though, as a follow-up to that, these two Minkis, the Minka whose story we begin to be told in This Earth of Mankind, the Minka who's telling the story, is the historical model on which Minka is based, Tirto Adisuryo, this journalist, this pioneer, is that a third Minka or is that the second Minka in your reading?
I think, well, it depends on which book. I think by the third volume, the voice is intended to be, to the extent fiction allows you to be the voice of Tirto Adisuryo. The first two books are how Pramudia imagined Minka would write about his youth. And of course he had some evidence for that because Tito Adisurio, as a young man, did write short stories. So that was a reference. But I can't give away the spoiler of the fourth volume, which makes this whole story even more complicated. So Siddhartha is going to be reading very intensely for the next few days. I can't give away that spoiler because that would be too much of a giveaway. But I know, I remember very much, I think I tell a little bit of the story in Indonesia Out of Exile. I remember very much sitting in the lounge room of Yusuf Ishak with Hashim Rahman, the other publisher there, and Pramudia, all talking about whether or not in the third volume to use the name Tito Adisurio in the text or not.
Say more about
Initially, in the original text it says Tito Adisurio, but in the books they changed it to TAS and not mentioning the name. But the reason was a legal one, in that something which is, I won't give the spoiler away, but something which is a part of the story in volume 3 was was sufficiently not true to raise the possibility of one of the descendants of Tito Adisurio starting a legal case. So they changed from Tito Adisurio to TAS.
That's fascinating. One lives and learns about this. This is a delayed after effect for me of reading Pramudia. I didn't realize that before. But just to emphasize one thing about this, and I'm not going to give the plot away, don't worry. But the reason I wanted to ask that is because part of the power of these books is the reconstruction of a history that was lost twice over, right? Once with the killing of, the doing away of the historical Tirto Adisurio, this journalist who began the Sarakat Islam and the mass movement, and then again in '65 when Pramudia's historical research was all destroyed. And so I think it is important. I wanted to hear you talk about the significance of it becomes more and more historical as you read the quartet. You realize that actually Minka is based on a real historical figure. And I think that may be obvious from the first volume to some extent, but I think that's important.
Because I think the only historical documentary materials that Pramudia was able to find about Tito Adisurio's youth were the short stories that Tito Adisurio wrote when he was younger. So apart from that, there's very little. We know who his parents were and so on, but very little details about his life. So the first book and the second book, I think, are Pramudia imagining what might have happened to the young man, the high school student and young man who was living in Java at that time. The third volume, though, is, even though he takes some liberties to make it a more readable novel, it's, I think, so much based on historical research and accuracy that in the original manuscript, yes, he did use the actual name Tito Adisurio.
That may allow us to shift to talking about the story about the story. To learn about the importance of the editors in bringing out these books. And actually, maybe I can turn to you, Siddhartha, to turn to that question of what you called the story of the story, the way the story came together, and ask you. We can ask Max about his book, which is all about this. That's one of the great things about this book, Indonesia Out of Exile, that we learn how the editors were involved. But I'm curious about what interests you in the story about the story.
Well, I haven't finished reading Max's biography either, but I started reading it because, and I think in some ways Max's translation and Pramudia's repetition abroad are kind of very closely intertwined. So I'm curious, I want to hear from Max, because Pramudia conceived this in prison and then came out when he was released. It was published in Indonesian, but you started translating it into English while working for the Australian government in for the Australian embassy. And then what happened? I want to know about that. I mean, it's probably there in your book, but I haven't got to that part yet. But I felt like that's a central part because we hear so much about censorship. We hear so much about, but we usually hear it only from one particular perspective. That it's usually left-wing totalitarian governments. We don't ever hear about, our Western democracies. So I'm just curious about that. What was your role in bringing the book out, and what happened when you started translating it?
Well, yes, I was at that time working in the Australian Embassy in Jakarta. So, I was very young then, my late 20s, so I wasn't a senior position, of course. But I was taken to Pramudia's house by a mutual friend and so I was able to chat with Pramudia for a short while, and then I was introduced to his editor and publisher, two men who'd also been in prison for 14 years, and who'd, with Pramudia, had made the decision they were going to publish the books he had written while in prison. And I was given a typeset manuscript to read, and I read it in one reading, and I went back to the editor-publishers next day, or the people who were planning to publish it, and said, I've translated Indonesian literature before. I translated plays and poems by Rendra, which have been published in the US and Australia. I want to translate this because the world outside needs to see this Indonesia. Because my experience in Indonesia was, my experience of Indonesia sort of made the sense of Indonesia that I had was already, was reflected so much in this Earth of Mankind. The change, as Faisal was saying, the change from how victims transformed into agents, fighters and agents of change. I had met so many people like that. So many people like that came out of the oppression of 1965. So that was the Indonesia that I knew, and so I said, and they said yes. Well, after some discussions and so forth, they said yes. So I started working on it in the evenings and on the weekends while I was working in the embassy, and then, being rather young and naive, I told when I was finished and Penguin Australia had accepted the manuscript, very naively, I told the Australian ambassador that I'd done this, an extreme act of naivety, and he said, well, you have 24 hours to leave Australia, to leave Indonesia, 24 hours to leave Indonesia, go back to Australia. And I said, well, that's not very long. He said, no, you got to go now. I can't afford for the Indonesian government ever to be able to say that we knew you translated it and we allowed you to stay here. So I said, oh, that's a very political way of looking at it. I better hold the press conference before I go. And he changed it to a week. So I had a week, but then I had to come back to Australia. They put me in a part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs where there was no work to do.
Interesting.
Which was, pleasant, but I'd already decided in any case, being the voice or representative of reactionary governments like we have in Australia and the United States was not my career path. So I soon left the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and for a few years I worked more or less full-time on translating the other three books.
Wow, it's like something out of a John le Carré novel.
Thank you for asking that, because that actually doesn't appear in Indonesia. That's one of the things you don't talk about, really.
No, the book's not about me. The book's about Pramudia, Yusuf Ishak, and Hashim Rahman, the three people. Pramudia, of course, is the author who had the courage to publish, to agree to his books being published within a few months of returning from getting out of prison, and without the other two, his comrades in arms, Hashim Rahman, who'd been in the same hut on Buru Island as Pramudia, and Yusuf Ishak, who'd been in jail for more than 10 years in a prison in Jakarta. Without the commitment of those two men, the book would not have been published. because it's a key thing. It's a bit of a contradiction. You know, Pramodia, Hashim, and Yusuf, they were all released from prison in 1978 and 1979. So after 14 years in prison, no trial, no charges, etc., they come back. They're released along with 15,000 other prisoners. But it's important to remember, because this is a bit of a weird contradiction, I think, their release from prison did not reflect a situation where the Suharto dictatorship was loosening up. It reflected two things: intervention from the United States under Jimmy Carter, a credit point for him, although he turned a blind eye to what Indonesia was doing in East Timor at the same time. But it was also because the Suharto regime just knew you can't keep 20,000 people in prison forever. You've got to deal with it at some point. So they were all released because of those factors at a time when the Suharto dictatorship was at its height of repression. All student councils had been banned right across the country. Students and intellectuals from 1974 to 1978 went into jail again. More newspapers were banned. More magazines were banned. So Pramudia, Hashim and Yusuf came out of prison in a climate that was very repressive, where they themselves had ID cards which marked them as ex-political prisoners, where they had to report to the police every week, and where students and intellectuals were all being repressed and put in jail exactly at that time. And despite that repression, despite the repression being at its height, or of course, its real height was 65, 66, when 1 million people were killed. But post that initial repression, 78, 79 was the peak. Despite that, they decided, can I use bad language? Or
Please.
They decided, fuck the regime, we are going to publish these books and we're going to put on the front cover that they were works from Buru Island, on the front cover. And they put the books out within 12 months of getting out of jail at the height of repression. That's the kind of people they were. And without people like that, especially Yusuf and Hashim, who did all the front running of actually getting the books out and circulated and being interrogated, all I tell that story all in Indonesia Out of Exile. The books would have never have seen the light of day in Indonesian, and probably not in English either. Maybe someone from a university press would have translated them in English, and you'd be paying $100 for a book that was in minor circulation rather than Penguin paperback.
So can I pick up on what may seem like a minor point? I remember you actually saying a couple of days ago that the Buru tetralogy has appeared, but no longer with the, from Buru, Karya Buru Pulau. No longer... No, sorry, yes. Karya Buru Pulau. But no longer does it announce this. And I think that this leads me, I'm trying to gear up to a question I know that Siddharth has about contemporary politics in Indonesia, the contemporary situation. But I'm thinking of the fact that your work, Faiza, and I know the work of other writers recently in Indonesia, have returned to Buru, to the experience of Buru, the experience of the camps and the aftermath. So I'm wondering if you can talk about, both of you, either of you, to talk about the place of the work of Buru, Pram's work of Buru, in contemporary Indonesia.
Well, I think I think the popularity of Pramudia's books and their recognition, both amongst very many readers in Indonesia and literary critics and etc., and its success overseas, has meant that it's remained in Indonesia on people's radar still today. And there's not a serious bookshop in Indonesia that does not sell Pramudia's books today. And since Suharto fell, more ex-political prisoners have also written their books about Buru Island. there are some mainstream literary writers who've written books about what happened in 1965, but for me, I think they're still very biased. They're still very influenced by anti-communist prejudice. I think Faiza's play Silent Song of the Genji Flowers is one of the first literary works that presents people from that tradition without that bias. And I think that's that's also why it's been screened in Indonesia a couple of times, and Indonesians in New York or Austin or Los Angeles or wherever have come to see it, and they still the film of that play still has a massive impact. So I think Pramudia opened the door. Other political prisoners have taken the opportunity of writing their memoirs now that the door is open. But I think the real literary or creative power now comes from people like Faiza and others who make it relevant today, who consciously try to make it relevant today. I think there's two things. One is Faiza's play. The other was the concert that she produced, where songs written by female political prisoners, not on Buru Island, but on the Plantungan women's camp, were Faiza arranged for young contemporary musicians to adapt them for, when was that performed?
2017.
So quite recently.
To give the context about 65, Pulau Buru, Buru Island, in my opinion, there were little bit missing about the 65 events, especially towards women's political prisoners. There are not only Pulau Buru, Buru Island camp prisoner, but also women camp called Plantungan. It's a big camp as well in Central Java. Almost 1,000 women were there, got tortured, and there were almost 14 years in the camp. But sometime the historian missed to remember about, the forgotten women. So that's why when I remember that, if you remember the story of Nyai Ontosoro, that Pram told inside the Buru Island to encourage all the prisoners in Pulau Buru with using women character, Nyai Ontosoro, to encourage them. But women in prison in Plantungan often forgotten. And it's very important for me, women who were in Plantungan women camp in Central Java, most of them were a member of the biggest women organization in Indonesia called Gerwani, Gerakan Wanita Indonesia, or in English, Indonesian Women Movement. At that time, one of the biggest women organization in the world, as I read, So that's very important part of the Indonesian history that often forgotten. So my play inspired from those women who survived after Camp Plantungan and how they survive in their late age, and how they face stigma and memorizing about their youth. So very important for me. That's
Thank you very much.
context.
I want to leave time for questions from the audience, but are there additional comments from Siddharth? Okay, yes. Why don't we open this up to audience questions? And I believe there's a microphone that you can all play with too, over here. Yes, a question from, it looks from this distance as if it's Joel.
Chris, just for a moment, if you would turn the moderator around and invert it on yourself, and just tell us a little bit about Pramodya's impressions of New York when he was here in, I think, 1999, and your experiences bringing him?
That's a big question. That's a very good question. I've been thinking about it because it is almost a sort of, it's almost been 25 years. Just about now, he was here in April. And there are too many ways to answer that question. As I'm thinking about the best way, let me point out that he came with his wife, Maimuna, but also with Yusuf Isak. Yusuf Isak was a very important presence, and he's someone that Max talks a lot about in the book too. So it was really their collective responses to New York, in a sense, that one point that I would make, I've been puzzling over, this may not be the most important. We asked him that question, by the way, repeatedly, what's your first impression of New York? I think his first impression of the US was, it's very clean. But then his second impression was I don't know, a little bit different. He did comment, and this has puzzled me because, and I've been meaning to ask you, Max, about this, but he did comment at one point about there was a protest sign when he went to Washington, D.C., and he seemed bothered by the extreme impoliteness of the protest. And this puzzled me because Pram was very forthright. He refused to accept suggestions that he toned down his rhetoric, because we did want him to get back to Indonesia, but he was talking about having, a trial for Suharto and such like. But it was always puzzled that he suggested that somehow there was a limit beyond which political protest had gone in Washington. I was wondering if there's something I'm missing about Pram's understanding of American politics. But Max is not jumping to the microphone.
I would have to say that in all my conversations with him in Indonesia, I never heard him use a swear word. So if it was a sign that had, a vulgar swear word on it, then I can understand him. I can understand him saying that, because he could be, he was before 1965 in his polemics against the salon writers that were active at the time. He was savage in his critique of them. But I've never heard him use a vulgar swear word.
I suppose most of his offensiveness came in the form of extreme politeness. My apologies in the name of experience, ma'af, I guess. Yes. That's the beginning of an answer, Joel, to your question. I don't know if you want to follow that up. Other questions? Yes, over here.
Hi, thank you all for the talk. It was really wonderful. I have a question for Max. I'm really looking forward to reading the book about the story behind the story, but I'm a student at Columbia right now doing my MFA in fiction, and I've also been taking classes in the literary translation department. So I would love to hear you speak about the process of translating, especially since you talked about, wanting to share this world to a Western audience. What decisions you had to make in terms of teaching the reader about a foreign country and about a foreign world, if you had to stealth gloss or add some explanatory sections in it, or just what that experience was like.
Well, first I should say, of course, that I did it 40 years ago when I was 29, and I often get emails also from PhD students doing theses on the translation, the technical sort of translation side, and they say, how come you use this word and not that word? To be honest, in most cases, I can't reply because I can't remember, because it's so long ago. The process was, I think, probably not the usual, because I'm not a lifelong translator. I translated those 4 novels. I translated one non-fiction work by Pramodya. I translated a 5th novel by Pramodya, Arok Dedes, and I've translated lots of other documents over the years, but not as a translator. So I'm not a lifelong person dedicated to translation. The process was, I sat down at night with a typewriter and 3 or 4 dictionaries in case I needed them. Fortunately, at that point, my Indonesian was sufficient. I didn't have to go to a dictionary too often. I tried asking Pramudia, can I discuss the translation? He said, no, I don't want to know. That's your business. But there was another process that went alongside it, which I think worked as a kind of osmosis thing. Because the thing was, Yusuf Ishak, Hashim Rahman and Pramudia, I was very much on the same political and ideological and spiritual wavelength as them. I think that was also, we were all on the same ideological / spiritual wavelength. So we had many, many discussions, not about the text, but about the ideas in the book, about why they loved the book, about why Pramudia decided to write the books. How did he, the whole history of how he did the research for the books before 1965 and why, what about that motivated him. So I think there was a spirit, I mean, this is very unscientific, unscholarly, etc., but I think there's a kind of spirit osmosis that as I translated with all these conversations, I think that helped formed how the translation evolved. On the technical side of the question you asked, some people ask, well, why didn't you translate Ibu as mum or mom, the American one? And I think it's because there are no Ibus in America or Australia. It's a different social phenomenon. The Javanese Ibu, Indonesian, it's a different social phenomenon. So there's not actually an English word for it. So used the honorifics and the occasional. Did I have footnotes or not? The very occasional footnote, I think.
You left out a footnote from the original.
Did I?
Minka's name. How to pronounce Minka's name.
Or how to pronounce Minka's name. But that's in the text also, I think, isn't it? Anyway, 40 years ago. So that's, was sitting at night or in the weekends with the book, the dictionary, but also going back and forth to speak to Pramudia, Yusuf and Hashim on a regular basis. I think that's the story of it. It went through lots of edits. Penguin Australia had an edit to go through it, and then when it was published in the United States, it went through another edit. And so often I can't even answer the question, was that word because of me or because of the editor? Because it's so long ago now. And to be honest, it was such a intense, stressful experience. Having the responsibility to be the person that introduced Pramudia to the English-speaking world, because prior to that there was only no English language translation of Pramudia was widely circulated, and this was going to be published not by a university press or a small press somewhere. It was going to be published by Penguin, which, although it was Penguin Australia and UK, it was bound to be eventually published internationally. So there's a lot of stress and intenseness connected to this. So after I finished, for a long time, I didn't really want to go back and review it, except I had to every time the publisher wanted to do another edit. So sometimes now, why did you, the American edition, they changed all the things from meters to feet. There are those sorts of changes, little changes like that. In some other, the editors here thought some other words I used were too commonly used in Australia, but not commonly used in the United States. So some of them were changed also, but nothing, I think. So in the end, and I don't consider myself to be as good a translator as Pramudya is a writer. I can't see anyone can really, as anyone around who can claim that. But my satisfaction is when people do email me or get correspondence after they read the book. And if you go, and it's also very interesting to go to Amazon.com and see what there's usually 30 to 40 readers' comments where they read the book and make their comments. It's very interesting to see what they get out of it. And on the whole, what they've gotten out of reading it was what I wanted them to get out of reading it. So that's in some sense, for me, the measure of success.
Thank you for that question. Are there more questions? Are there questions? Yes, there is over here. Oh, over here. Ah, yes.
Hello. I wanted to ask about when you were mentioning earlier that you and Pramodya and the other two had a shared ideological outlook, and I was curious if internationalism and third worldism played a role in that, and if so, what it was. Sorry, I know that's a bit out of left field.
Was that internationalism and third worldism? It's interesting for me to reflect on it because, what inspired their own sort of ideological, political, spiritual outlook was their experience, their role, and their commitment to the Indonesian nation and its independence, because they were all youth under the Dutch. They were all young people under the Dutch, so they were part of the struggle for Indonesian independence. Pramudya was in jail. Hashim Rahman was smuggling guns into Sumatra. Yusuf Ishak was writing material for the first Indonesian anti-Dutch newsletters after the Japanese came and so on. They were all committed to an Indonesia that they saw as egalitarian, democratic, and a country which should be an inspiring country that ordinary people would feel inspired to be a part of. Now that's a bit weird that I'm on the same wavelengths as them, because I was a 29-year-old Australian from the western suburbs of Sydney, brought up on Hollywood movies. But I think it was the experiences I'd had in Indonesia from 1969 until 1980, most of which were either relating to ordinary people and their struggles, or I was lucky enough during that period to often have relationships with and collaborative relationships with dissidents, critics, and opponents of the dictatorship. And perhaps that experience, although many of those people I had the collaborative relationship with were anti-communist because of the era they were created in, 60s and 70s, I think it was a bridge to sharing that same... It was just so wonderful. I mean, if you read This Earth of Mankind, the kind of persons that are being created by the social processes of that time, Nyaya Dosoro, Sandikam to Nyai, Minka, from the young Minka to the first publisher of a Malay language newspaper that tried to speak for ordinary people, that process of change was so exciting and inspiring. And I think it was sharing that sense of excitement and inspiration about what the country had tried to be and what they still hoped it could be was what we shared. Were they internationalists? Yes, Yusuf Ishak had been the Secretary General of the Asia-Africa Journalists Association before he was arrested. Hashim Rahman had played similar roles. Pramodia translated both Russian, Chinese, not Chinese, Russians, Western European literature. They were all part of that, the internationalist sentiment of the third world back before 1965. Something which has probably been very weak in Indonesia today.
Thank you for that question. Other questions? Yes, over here.
Thank you. You started, Faiza, by talking about the excitement of being an Indonesian woman, recognizing a character from further back. But it's sort of unusual, perhaps, Pram and Rendra as sort of maybe two Indonesian authors who actually, for their era, got into gender. So I'm wondering, what were the elements when you really saw that to then present it on stage for new Indonesian women? And part of what your work does so nicely is take other stories and then interpret them for an Indonesian stage or for an Indonesian audience for women. What were the elements that were important to you about the women he created that you felt you needed to have speak to younger Indonesian women today? What was it that he got right so well about women as a male author?
It's a complex question. I think Prams create many women's character in every his writings. For me, he always create the character from someone become someone. It's like transform something. In feminist perspective, that's very important. It's like for the relevant today, for example, like, you are a victim, how from victim become survivor, for example. That's very, very strong example from Sanikem become Nyai Ontosoro. That's, Prams very aware about that. I think not only, I mentioned before, that's not only in tetralogy, but also in others books like The Girls from the Coast and Midah Bergigi Emas, Larasati, all those character of female characters in his writings, always like that. So, to contextualize today, that's very, very relevant today for even for the new readers. When I perform on the stage, also I try to how the actor Nyai Ontosoro, transform from Sanikem become. It's very challenging from Sanikem become Nyai Ontosoro, how to show the fight, the struggle, the process to becoming Nyai Ontosoro. That's also very challenging, to present on the stage.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question? Okay. You mentioned about Rendra. I not really aware actually about Rendra's work, some poems. Even Rendra actually very criticized on Nyai Ontosoro characters. Rendra criticized about Nyai Ontosoro is like snob character, not convincing. Become is a very different view of mine.
Nicely critical of the dual position of revolutionary women, both speaking out for the revolution and state off the problem. So even how revolutionary men would sexualize these female leaders, he was aware of that dynamic in some of his stuff. That's the quote I most remember. So he's much more
Or
he gets in, and Renberg was there, and
yeah, I think so.
they're very rich female characters, and most men from that era of Indonesia, their writings on women are very flat. And
Me.
his are not flat; they're very, very nuanced and subtle.
I think so. All Pram's all female characters in the hero was very rich, very it's not object, but I think it's in the world today. It's very active against, very active against, very strong against. To fight something, not not object. I think that the simple way is not object character, but subject character, subjectivity of women.
I'm hearing the last line that you quoted from Bumi Manusia. What was that last line that you quoted at the beginning of this session?
Kita telah melawan sebaik-baiknya. See, even Nyai Ontosoro defeated, of course, defeated towards the big colonialism, but she still proud because of she fight. That's very. I think that's character that's also dragged me into this is very inspiring story. I mean, many books, many story of women, many character of women. They just it's like tidak berdaya. What's that? Was tidak berdaya? Powerless, powerless. But all the characters in Pram's story, the female characters, very, very difficult situation, but always find a way to fight. I think that's
Even the milkmaid character who's just there for
which one?
the milkmaid. Mimi, the milkmaid,
The minor character.
a minor character, young,
Yeah,
who's
Mida.
milking the cows and
Yeah.
bossed around by Annalise, Nyai Ontosoro's daughter, but actually in her comments, quite sort of biting comments against Annalise, very much the workers' comments, women workers' comments.
Am I being told there's another question? Okay.
Yes.
Back here. Okay.
We were told that Siddhartha would make some comments on contemporary Indonesia, and we didn't hear them. And I would like to hear them.
Oh, no, I wasn't going to make the comments. I was asking Faiza to talk about contemporary Indonesia, and I believe she did in her quite extensive, because, I mean, my questions were to them about contemporary Indonesia.
Yes, my apologies if I had misspoken or spoke too quietly. I think Siddhartha had said, let's be sure to talk about contemporary politics. And I think we've heard that you can't read Pramudia without thinking about contemporary politics. Although, of course, there's much more to be said on that topic.
Well, it's a huge topic. I mean, Indonesia today, there's a 1 zillion aspects you can talk about. I think in terms of the story behind the story of Pramudia's books, the key thing to understand is that while it's unclear whether they are or are not officially banned, you can get them anywhere. You can buy his books anywhere. You can buy books about him pretty much anywhere. You can buy books that are now about the history of class struggle or left-wing history in Indonesia anywhere. So that situation's greatly changed. On the other hand, the thing which has not changed, which is that relates directly to the books. I mean, there's many things which have changed and many things have not changed in respect to political economy and social structure, etc., etc. But the other thing that hasn't changed is that in the early 1970s in Indonesia, the Indonesian government took a decision to change their education curriculum so that no longer would Indonesian children be taught Indonesian literature. So children who went to state schools from the early 1970s up until today, while they do a subject at school called Indonesian language, they do not do a subject Indonesian literature. In the subject Indonesian language, you can be asked to learn off by heart a list of authors, literary works, and the year they are published, and the generation that the author belonged to. But there's no practice in the state schools. It is a bit different in some private schools, but in the state schools you are not asked as a part of your school education to read novels, read short stories, read plays, read poems, discuss them in class, write essays about them. That's still totally absent. And I think that's one of the criminal acts of the Suharto New Order dictatorship. Obviously did not love literature and did not love children. Because if you love children and if you love children, even if you didn't love literature, you'd still want them to read literature. And if you love literature and didn't love children, you'd still want to see. It seems they neither love children nor literature. And I think that's, in relating to the story behind the story and the story of the books into the future, changing that is one of the big challenges. Of course, in terms of the state of democracy and social movements, that's a whole big separate subject.
Okay. Is it time for Max to start signing books, perhaps? Joel.
On cue, I will come and close this down. I mean, we're going to give these folks a big, healthy applause, I hope, to start. And before I turn you over to the signing, I'll remind you of a couple things. I mean, the story of the story in this book didn't really get discussed here, and I think Max is being coy and saving it for you, but in the Philippines there was Jose Rizal, whose book was so important to independence. Dante unified the Italian language, but Pramodia's book, according to Max, which is very convincingly argued, this is why I'm going to make the pitch for you to buy this from our friends at Greenlight, it became a roadmap for the student movement that brought down the dictatorship. And it's not just sort of the idea like books are important as a collective. It's this particular quartet told these students that they couldn't do the protest movement without the other groups that are traditionally included in intersectional politics. So it's an amazing read. I hope you'll get it from our friends at Greenlight. I hope you'll talk to our friends at Lapham's who are also here co-presenting this. And I thank you all so much for being here. Let's give one more round of applause.